Okay, so here's our agenda. We'll start with a brief recap of our last quarterly meeting, which took place in March 2023. And then we will move into our technical updates from our sub-teams that are working on the future conditions modeling. Then we'll have an overview of the planning and design checklist updates. And then our last topic will be the study schedule update. So just at the top of the meeting, we usually like to, we like to cover the study purpose in case we have new folks that are on the line. So to start us off, this work is funded under the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative Action Plan 3 Focus Area 5. We have an interagency team that is working to identify the range of future Great Lakes water levels, wave heights, and ice conditions under a set of warming climate scenarios. And we are using proven models to advance our understanding of future Great Lakes conditions. And then also to complement the future conditions modeling that we're doing, we're also developing planning and design checklists that are intended to be used by stakeholders implementing Great Lakes coastal restoration projects. So we're envisioning that the checklist will be a companion resource that stakeholders can use to incorporate resilient features into their work. And I will ask that you mute yourself. I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. Great, thanks. Okay, so our March 2023 recap. So to help set the stage before we get into the technical team updates, we wanted to touch on an important piece that was covered during that meeting, which is the historical bias correction process that we were in the midst of in March when we last met. So if you'll recall back, in March, the technical team presented an overview of an issue with the historical meteorological forcing data that we were using for the baseline scenario that had become apparent through our comparison of the model results with the model results coming out of our computationally complex check models. And so the check models team helped us identify that the historical forcing data was causing the baseline static water level results to be too high. And you can see that here in the sample graph that we have. The green box was our baseline, and the purple box is the actual. So we were higher than the actual. And so we discovered through investigation that it appeared that the historical data sets that we were using had periods of unrealistic meteorological conditions, which the team eventually contributed to changes in the quality of monitoring data over the historical record and the number of stations. And essentially, these were the reasons for some periods of poor, unrealistic data. So we needed to come up with a way to correct for these biases in the historical forcings data sets. So in March, where we left off, we had made some progress in the bias correction, and you can see that in the yellow box on the right. So we had made some corrections and we were getting closer, but we weren't there yet. But today we're happy to report that we do now have a bias corrected data set, and this is going to be a large focus of today's meeting is presenting those results. So to help set the stage for that, discussion, we wanted to review some definitions and terminology, which will hopefully, help guide us all through this somewhat technical conversation. So when we refer to historic meteorology, we are talking about the unmodified or the original atmospheric forcing data sets that are run through our model. When we refer to the bias-corrected historical meteorology, we're talking about the data sets that have been, modified by our team to address the issues that were identified. And when we refer to the weather generator baseline simulation, this is the model run that is using the bias-corrected historical meteorology data set. And similarly, when we refer to the weather generator climate change scenario simulation, this is the simulation that is using the bias-corrected data, but we are tweaking it, we're perturbing it to simulate future conditions, like future warming and precipitation conditions. And so to go over our workflow, which we touch on in these quarterly meetings, but just to kind of bring it back before we take the deep dive, we have our study workflow here. And so our static water level workflow is on the left hand of this diagram, and you'll see like the red dotted line kind of dividing into two pieces. So on the left is the series of models that we use to develop our future static lake levels. On the right-hand side is the set of models and the workflow that we use to develop the wave and surge, the estimated wave and surge. So for the left-hand side, we are using the bias-corrected historical meteorology, and we run that through the weather generator to produce the forcings that are then ingested by the lake level models in the blue boxes on the left-hand side. And then we use our computationally complex check models to perform a check on our lake level results to make sure that what our efficient models are producing are reasonable. And those have already, come in handy for flagging the initial issues with our data set. So we're definitely making use of those check models. And then on the right-hand side, to get the distribution of future wave and surge, kind of our inputs are percent ice coverage, the storm suite of observed events in the Great Lakes, and we'll also have our range of static water levels, and we'll run those through the wave and surge models. In our case, our team is using SWAN and ADCIRC, and then we'll end up with a distribution of wave and surge. And then at the end of the process, we'll combine our static lake levels with the wave and surge, and then we'll end up with the distribution of future total lake levels for each of the Great Lakes. So before we move into the technical team updates, I do want to pause and see if there are any questions about the March 2023 recap or the model workflow before we move into the new material. Scudder, go ahead. I see your hand raised.
Yeah, of course, I've got a question. Why not? I'm wondering, unfortunately, I missed the last meeting, and I have heard about the bias because I know it rolls into what we're doing in the Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Study as well. A question would be, when you're looking at the actual historic data, is that basin-wide, or is that sort of a summary or an integration of all the lakes? Or is that being done on a lake-by-lake basis? And the reason I'm asking is I know that, I work on Lake Erie, shallowest of the lakes, and local atmospheric disturbances may have a much more significant impact on Lake Erie than on the other larger, deeper lakes, where, they're not near as responsive just because of the size, the volume of the water. So just want some clarification there so I understand better.
Yeah, sure. Lauren, I'm going to ask you to comment. Otherwise, I can answer.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
Thanks for that question. It's a good question, and we are looking at it lake by lake. So we're taking a pretty systematic approach, looking at the corrections that we need to make on that lake by lake basis.
Okay, so this is basically in response to the initial work you've done on Lake Ontario, correct? And then you're also moving up to Lake Superior and then through the rest of the lakes sequentially, is that right?
I mean, for this process, we actually have to model all of the upper lakes at once, for lake level modeling, we have to do all of the upper lakes before we even get to Lake Ontario. So we're just kind of, for the forcing purpose, we're looking at them all at once.
Okay, understood. All right. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Scudder. I don't think I see any additional hands raised or questions in the chat. So with that, we will move on to our technical team updates. And I will pass it over to Dr. Scott Steinschneider from Cornell to give us an update on the weather generator.
Sure. So usually when we do these quarterly meetings, we start with the stochastic weather generator because in terms of the model flow, the output from the weather generator is eventually what is going to force the different models that sort of simulate water supplies into the lakes, which will then go into the model that simulates how water is routed through the lake so we can get lake levels. For this quarterly meeting, we'll maintain that order for consistency with past quarterly meetings, but to some extent, it actually makes the most sense to start talking about the effort we put into bias correcting historical meteorology. So I'm going to briefly comment on that because it's important for the weather generator, but I know it's going to be covered in more detail in the next by the next team lead. So the stochastic weather generator, it's a model that simulates weather and can bake into simulated weather different climate change scenarios, but it operates on some baseline set of historical meteorology. So we need to make sure that that historical meteorology is quote unquote good, that we feel good about it before fitting the weather generator to those data. So as Caitlin mentioned before, and as will be covered in a bit more detail after we leave the stochastic weather generator section, some initial experiments had shown that the historical meteorology that we were starting with was leading to biases in lake levels, and therefore fitting the weather generator to those data wasn't the ideal thing to do. So Cornell, so my lab's effort in conjunction with a lot of other folks as part of the team, Cornell was just acting in a supporting role, tried to help bias correct the historical meteorology. That's been completed. It'll be covered in the next section. And what I'll simply comment on now is that we've taken that bias corrected historical meteorology that we feel good about. We have already refit the stochastic weather generator on those data. So thanks, Caitlin. So this is sort of the last couple of bullets in the completed work. We've been able to develop a new baseline 1,000-year sequence from that bias-corrected historical meteorology, and that's en route to others on the team right now. And we've already started to establish the set of climate scenarios that we're going to be generating based on or using those historical meteorological data as a starting point. So that's where we are in terms of the stochastic weather generator team. And in terms of what we're currently doing and what we plan to do going forward, right now we're in the process of finalizing the future climate scenarios that we are going to generate with the weather generator. And as part of that process, we've already downloaded some CMIP6 scenarios for the Great Lakes. We're shifting over to use a recently released LOCA 2 downscaled version of those data. We're then looking at those data to get a sense of the range, the potential range of climate changes that we would want to create scenarios for. And then we would use the weather generator to create daily sequences of weather across the whole Great Lakes Basin for those scenarios. So that is in process. And then once that's done, we're ready to pull the trigger on developing the full final set of future climate scenarios for the entire Great Lakes Basin, which is the sort of the end product of the stochastic weather generator for this product. So that is very close to being, I would say, completed. So we feel very good about that. And then in terms of what we do after that, then we would want to really shift towards careful documentation of the model, its performance, and sort of the justification behind the scenarios that we create with the model. So I think I'll leave it there because I think the bulk of what I would likely spend time on is on that historical bias correction, which I think is going to be discussed next. But I'm happy to take any questions before that.
Thanks, Scott. Let's see, looking for questions coming through the chat, but I agree we may have more questions after we hear from the next team and the pieces start to come together. Yeah, yep, not seeing hand raised or any questions in the chat just yet. So Lauren, I will pass it over to you. So I'll introduce Dr. Lauren Fry from NOAA GLRI and Dr. David Cannon from University of Michigan Siegler to walk us through the lake level modeling and check models updates.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Caitlin. So we have been lumping the check model presentations together with the water level modeling because those check models are really used as a way of, checking for biases in the runoff and evaporation components of the water level modeling flow. So these are the people involved. I'm going to talk primarily about like the blue boxes, which is the workflow for propagating the weather generator output to runoff, precipitation over the lake, and evaporation from the lake to net basin supply, and then routing that through regulation and routing models to get lake levels and outflows. Then I'm going to hand it off to David, who's going to talk about the work that the team at Siegler has been doing with check models to continue their effort. So we can go to the next slide, Caitlin, and I'll just start with this first overview of completed, ongoing, and next steps, and then we'll get into some of the details on the forcings work that we've all been doing. So as far as completed work, and this is mostly done by team members from Army Corps of Engineers in Detroit District. So they've completed a workflow development and testing for the upper lakes. They've calibrated the large basin runoff model using the Clapeyron representation for potential evapotranspiration. And then this third bullet is kind of the newer one since the last time, and that's completed tests of multiple, and I should have kind of italicized and bold and enlarged that word, multiple iterations of alternative historical forcings data for biases on net basin supply and water levels, so that we could really give the weather generator team a very robust data set for that for their input. And the good news that Caitlin mentioned is that we have finalized that forcing data set, and so Scott's team is off and running with that. I mean, I'll just say this was kind of an all hands on deck situation where all of the teams were contributing to this discussion. So please know it wasn't just me or even just the people on that slide. So as far as ongoing work, the Detroit team is working on refining and testing the workflow for the Lake Ontario component of the water level modeling because they needed the output from the upper lakes before running the Ontario output, and they're finalizing the baseline runs for the upper lakes. I think we're just really close to having those baseline runs done for the upper lakes, and then once that's done, they'll start working on the baseline runs for Lake Ontario. So we can go to the next slide. So Caitlin showed a smaller version of this. I just want to recap that where we were the last time we checked in with all of you in March. And I'm going to walk you through what this figure is showing because I'll be showing kind of iterations on this figure here. So this is an annual mean lakewide average water level for Lake Erie for a historical period. So the box plot on the left that says actual, that's the actual water levels for Lake Erie. We're just showing Lake Erie as an example here. The next box plot over that says RNBS, that's the distribution of water levels that resulted when we took what we call the residual net basin supply, the historical residual net basin supply, and routed it through the routing and regulation model to get a distribution of water levels. We think of that as kind of being the the best we can get in terms of like the net basin supply input. Anything else that's coming that any other differences we're seeing between that RMBS and the actual is really just coming from propagation of errors and you know, model output from the routing and regulation model, which we're not addressing here, but just so you have an idea, like and this is Lake Erie actually has a bit harder of a time with our RMBS because it's propagating through from the upper lakes. So to the right of that, we've got one that says WG input number 1. So this was the first weather generator input that we provided to them. And so this we used a set of forcings, and these are historical forcings. I'll talk more about what those were later. And we ran those through the runoff and evaporation models and used the precipitation. We got a net basin supply computed from those, and we routed it through regulation and routing, the regulation and routing model. You can see that there's a big difference between the RNBS and this output, and that was really concerning. So we had a really high bias, just resulting from that bias in the net basin supply that was derived from those forcings. So by the March meeting, we worked, with between the water level team and the check model team to identify kind of where that bias was coming from. We compared with evaporation output from the more computationally complex model FECOM, and it was really pretty obvious that evaporation was a pretty big contributor to that bias. And then we started looking at the forcings, and we had some pretty weird looking forcings that we realized we could we saw promise in getting better results by adjusting those forcings. So you can click through Caitlin here. So yeah, this was kind of a first test, I think, is what we showed you in March, where we just did some initial bias correction of the forcing, specifically focusing mostly on wind speed and cloud cover, which would seem to be most problematic. And we brought that net basin supply down, which brought us much closer to the water levels that we would get by routing that historical observed net basin supply, the RMBS. So we can go to the next slide here.
I just want to add before we move on, because I think Scudder asked a good question, and I think you hit on it, Lauren, but I just want to drive it home. So this is our Lake Erie plot, but the technical team took this same look at all of the lakes individually. So we did a comparison of actual and residual net basin supply, and then the weather generator results for each of the 5 Great Lakes. So we definitely looked at that. So
yeah,
wanted to add that. And now we'll go to the next one.
That's a real, thank you for pointing that out, because yeah, we can't, it would just be like a way too long and tedious presentation if we went through every single lake, but we will be including it in, project documentation. And we are seeing basically similar results where we had biases in that evaporation for all the lakes. So I'm going to talk through kind of what we did in terms of looking at and adjusting for those biases in the forcings. Before I do, I need to provide a definition, because you're going to see it on graphics here, and I don't think I've referred to it yet, but you're going to see something called GL shifts, GLSHFS, and that's the Great Lakes Seasonal Hydrological Forecasting System. It's really just the framework that is used for simulating and projecting net basin supply for the Great Lakes. And so that's the operational framework that the Army Corps uses. And part of that framework includes compiling the forcings data, which is what we used initially to provide the weather generator. So that GL shifts is really the initial set of data that we provided the weather generator team. And it's based on interpolation of surface observations, and those surface observations are really, on the land surface. So you're interpolating over this really big lake surface area. So the first thing we did was we looked at comparing the forcings that were used between GL shifts and the forcings that were used by the FECOM, the more computationally complex model, and this helped us kind of hone in on where the forcings issues were caused. So we identified that wind speed and cloud cover were really seemed to be the primary cause of that bias, and resulted in far too little evaporation. So we went through a lot of iterations that we're not showing here, but with each iteration, just bear in mind that each iteration involved doing the bias correction, running the water level simulation, and going back and looking at results. So each iteration involved multiple teams handing off data back and forth. So it was a complex procedure and involved a lot of complex discussion. So we started, one of the iterations that we're not going to show here because it didn't work, is that we started by looking at some of the kind of more wonky periods of data in the wind speed and cloud cover. Like there were periods where the wind speed would just start becoming extremely variable relative to other periods. So we tried to look at, okay, are there good periods versus bad periods? And we did the same for cloud cover, where we sometimes saw cloud cover that was like always above 40%, like never went below 40%. And those were definitely red flags to us. So we started by looking at whether we could use good periods to help bias correct bad periods. We're not showing that here because ultimately when we started digging into it, we had a hard time kind of coming up with a defensible and really good forcings data set using that approach. So in the end, what we did was we started by using a more advanced forcing data set to use as the benchmark for bias correction for wind speed and cloud cover. So we looked to reanalysis data products that would be more likely used for things like FECOM and the distributed hydrological modeling. So the two that we looked at were the North American Regional Reanalysis and the European equivalent, and both of these are reanalysis products. They incorporate both model data and observation data. We have a pretty good length of record over a continuous time, and so we use the ERA5, which is the European equivalent to the North American Regional Reanalysis product, because it goes back to 1940, and we use that data set as the benchmark for bias correcting the cloud cover and wind speed. And that worked pretty well, especially for wind speed. But then when we looked at cloud cover, we were still seeing that there were some biases in that output. So we took a look between the North American Regional Reanalysis and the ERA5, and we compared those two, and we thought that the NAR did a better job of the cloud cover, so we used that to further adjust the cloud cover on the ERA5. And each of these iterations involved coming back as a team, and we would have very good consensus discussions in order to agree to these forcings data sets. So the last thing we did, because once we did that, we felt like, okay, we've got a pretty good net basin supply data set that we're minimizing the bias to the extent that is possible. Once we did that, we wanted to make sure that we weren't gonna see changes in bias over long simulations, because essentially what we're going to do with the output at the end is compare future climate simulations with the baseline simulations. So we need to be able to know that those changes can be linearly related to those changes in temperature that we would be seeing, temperature and precipitation that we would be seeing from those climate change scenarios. Okay, so what we did was we gave it some really extreme precipitation and some really dry precipitation just as a test for that that sensitivity to those changes, and in effect that confirmed that the data sets that we kind of landed on should be good to go. And I could show you on the next slide, which we can go to, that the results from, or it'll be after this, but I'll show you, you know, that output there. So to sum it all up, you know, I think we want to put this to you as a table to show like what we started with and what we're actually providing the weather generator. And I, you know, can't even count how many columns there would be in between the original and the bias correction to as we went through those iterations of improvements. So we're just giving you the you know, first take that we realized was not good, and then the final bias corrected forcing. So the final forcings that we're providing the weather generator team are mostly similar to the initial forcings, which were the station-based, you know, interpolated data set for GL shifts. So overlay precipitation, and the forcings for runoff, which would be precipitation and temperature, are both coming from GL shifts directly, and they still are. For evaporation, that's where we were putting our effort on the forcings bias correction. So for air temperature, we're taking that from GL shifts directly, no changes. Dew point, we're taking that directly with no changes. For cloud cover, we're substituting ERA5 for the GL shifts cloud cover. And on top of that, we used monthly adjustments to that cloud cover based on that comparison with the other reanalysis product, the NAR. And then for wind speed, instead of using the GL shifts, we're using the ERA5 directly. So the reanalysis products are really just coming into play in the cloud cover and wind speed. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So this is kind of the summary slide of the final forcing data set and what it looks like when we propagate through the routing and regulation models to get water levels. So again, the furthest left box plot, and here actually we're looking at Lake Superior water levels, so it's new lake here. So on the farthest left, that's the distribution of actual water levels for the historical record that was simulated. And then the next one over is the water levels simulated using the residual net basin supply, which again is really the closest thing to observed net basin supply that we have. And then just to the right of that is showing the results for our adjusted forcing. So when we just take that second column of forcings data that I just showed you, which was mostly GL shifts plus the reanalysis products for wind speed and cloud cover, we get really, really close to what we get with the RNBS when we run RNBS through the water level modeling flow. So that was really good news. We did one test where we ran it for, you know, 1,000-year simulation just to make sure that we weren't going to accumulate too much bias. And, you know, you see a somewhat different change on the edges of those distributions, but really, you know, the median and, you know, the shape of that is really pretty similar. So we're feeling good about, you know, being able to run long simulations. And then I mentioned on the last slide the test we're doing where we really gave it a lot of precipitation and very little precipitation. So those are the next two box plots. And what we're seeing here is, like, if you kind of look at the difference between the median line of those two box plots and the median line of the adjusted forcings box plot, the difference between those, like the vertical distance, is really pretty similar. So we're feeling like, you know, it can handle the changes in climate that we're going to be throwing at it. So you know, we went through this process of coming up with these forcings. We've done some testing to where we feel that the forcings can, you know, reduce the bias to a really good degree. And so that's where we landed, and we've provided those to the weather generator team, and they are taking it and running with it. So I think that's it. Caitlin, do you want me to pause before I hand it off to David?
Yeah, I was just going to chime in and ask if this was maybe a good point to stop for questions. So I think we'll do that.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll pause and take questions on this portion of the presentation. So I'll pause and see if we have any hands raised or if any questions come through the chat. Oh, go ahead, Scudder.
Oh, sorry again. Actually, there's been a sidebar chat discussion, and one of the questions was when we looked at the Lake Erie plot that the regional net basin supply was about 0.25 meters higher than the historical. Of course, on the larger lakes, it appears as though you've been able to correct for that. Would this in part be due, and I accidentally sent something to Scott Steinscheider, so I apologize for that because I'm pretty much technically inept on this chat stuff. But would that be in part because Lake Erie is a little bit more susceptible and responsive to local precipitation events that are not going to be, in other words, much more variable and more responsive than the upper Great Lakes, which are of a larger volume? Just curious if it has to do with the variability and the responsiveness of Lake Erie relative to the other ones. That it's just a question.
Yeah, that's a good observation, and I think it is a valid, it is potentially a good explanation. I think another really important explanation to me is just the propagation of errors that come through the routing and regulation modeling. So once, you know, we have those net basin supplies, we still have to propagate it through Lake Superior, Michigan, Huron before it gets to Erie. So any, you know, changes in flows that we might be seeing are going to be propagating down to there. So I think that's a large part of it. But I think you could be right on some of the sensitivity to the you know, local impacts.
Okay. All right. Just curious. Thank you.
Other questions for Lauren and team? I'll go back to here. Okay. I'm not seeing anything come through the chat right now or any additional hands. So I think we're good to move on and hear from Dr. David Cannon. Thanks, Lauren.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. I'm using my phone, which I don't usually do. So I'm going to be talking about kind of the check model side of things. So these are the computationally complex models that we're using to validate or kind of as a gut check on the conceptual LBRM and LLTM model that are a lot simpler and run much faster, which is the whole point of this. So the big completion checkpoint is we have these historical model runs finished up using SVCOM sea ice, which we forced with NAR. So we have historical SVCOM output for all 5 lakes from 1979 through 2021. And that data is being used to validate or to check the evaporation and ice output from LLTM. So through that check model process, that's kind of how we identified a lot of these biases in the LLTM, evap, and ice outputs. And I don't want to, I guess, I feel like we're bashing everybody over the head with this bias correction stuff, but that is, like Caitlin and Scott and Lauren all said, we all worked very hard and together to figure this out and get it fixed. So part of what we did was we conducted that in-depth analysis of the LLTM historical forcings and comparing them both to NAR and ERA5 and figuring out how things need to be fixed, excuse me, like Lauren described before. So the other big completion point Lauren talked about this a little bit, but LBRM runoff simulations are either completed or nearly completed for most of the region. So as we're moving forward with this work, we are needing to kind of get these check models up and running for the future periods. So we have something to compare against for Scott's weather generator output and as it's forced through LTM, LBRM. So right now we are working on getting FECOM CIs running using some CMIP6 climate outputs from 2015 through 2100. And we're doing it on 3 different shared socioeconomic pathway scenarios. So SSP 1, 2.6, SSP 2, 4.5, and SSP 5, 8.5, which are essentially the like the lowest one is the green pathway forward, so that'd be reduced emissions, middle of the road is 2.6, and then the increased greenhouse gas emissions at 5, 8.5. So we are also working as part of our historical validation process. We found some issues with the ice parameterization in the LLTM, and we have some solutions in mind already. And now that we have the forcing data complete, we can kind of put those solutions into practice and make sure that we're getting better ice outputs from LLTM. We're also working on completing WRF hydro simulations for the historical periods and looking at kind of identifying which forcing data sets that we want to use to actually force WRF hydro, because the decision is not trivial. And next steps, we are continuing these FECOM CI's climate change simulations as well as the WRF hydro simulations during both historical and future periods. I think you can go to the next slide. So I just wanted to share a little bit of the progress with our CMIP6, so that future period forcing selection. So on the left, kind of the collection of 4 plots here, I'm showing CMIP6 forcing biases for air temp between 1979 and 2014, kind of taking the average and the biases over all of those years. And we've been spending a lot of time basically checking this forcing data to make sure that it looks decent compared to the historical record, because we don't want to run into the same issue with the check models that we ran into with LLTM with the forcing there. So you can see I'm showing 4 different CMIP6 models. They all have, pretty big variations in the amount of bias. Bias is on the y-axis, is the mean bias error, and then the week of the year, kind of averaged over the whole period, is on the x-axis. And you can see GFDL is kind of right down the middle, plus or minus 5 degree Celsius temperature biases. ECR3, which is a European model, is typically cold biased. MIROC 6, which I think is a Japanese model, is warm biased almost all the time. And then CSM2 kind of goes one side or the other throughout the year. So our plan right now is to essentially run SVCOM, or these check models, with a suite of CMIP6 out forcing inputs, and be able to ensemble kind of the results and get kind of a range of potential scenarios for the future. So part of that I am showing here on the right. So this is like preliminary results where we have forced SVCOM with 3 different forcing models, so GFDL, ESM4, ECR3, and MIROC 6. And we are looking at both the historical, which is in black, and the future periods, which are in red, for SSP 585, which is the very high greenhouse gas emission scenario. I also have a black line here to indicate, the dotted line to indicate what the observations show over the historical period. So our ensemble is able to, at least within the range of the ensemble, which is indicated with the shaded lines, really kind of encompass what the observations show over the historical period. So we're confident that we're at least going to, the range of our results for the future scenarios will be able to pick up, the best possible guess of what we're going to see for the climate projections. And I've just pointed out here, you can see that for basically all of the lakes, by mid to end century, we're looking at very low ice cover, average annual ice cover close to 0% by 2080, most of the regions. So I think that this is going to be really useful while we're comparing LLTM using the weather generator forcing. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, David. We'll pause for questions. Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat or hands raised. So thanks, David. Okay, with that, we will move on to our wave and surge team update, and I will open it up for Margaret Owensby with ERDIC's Coastal Hydraulic Laboratory.
Thanks, Caitlin. So as she said, I'm Margaret Owensby. I work at ERDIC's Coastal and Hydraulics Laboratory, and I'm serving as the ERDIC PI for the surge and wave component of the project. So for just as a reminder, for our portion of the project, we are also on the computationally complex side of that diagram that we've all been looking at. And just as a recap of what we're doing is we are developing and running coupled ADCIRC and SWAN models for each of the Great Lakes. And we'll be taking the eventual output of the models that you've just heard about. We'll be taking representative lake level and ice coverage conditions and running those for an array of storm events. And so you can see on this slide here on the left side, we've got basically some of the main players on the surge and wave modeling portion of our team. And then on the right side, you've got some of the major components of the people that are working on the statistical side of the house for us. So the actual model development and running the simulations is conducted by the modeling team, and then the folks on the right, so Madison and Roberto, they are responsible for developing and identifying the different storm events that we'll be simulating, as well as kind of on the back end of the project, conducting the statistical analysis and developing the hazard curves for the water levels and waves that are coming out of our modeling, and that will eventually be posted on the coastal hazard system. Next slide, please, Caitlin. So I think we just have a short amount of time just to give a brief update on kind of where we stand since we last spoke to you all. So pretty much our team has been focused on the calibration and validation of our Lake Ontario ADCIRC and SWAN models. And so we have conducted calibration and validation for 8 different historical storms for Lake Ontario. And we submitted a couple different versions of calibration and validation report. The first was mainly focused on our surge results that we were getting with the coupled models. And then the second updated report included the wave and ice implementation results that we were seeing kind of from the follow-up portions of our modeling for those 8 historical storms. So we submitted those reports for an internal review that was conducted by some subject matter experts within the Army Corps of Engineers. And we've also, we received some really great feedback from our reviewers that has helped improve the quality of our results. And we have responded to that feedback and have made edits to that report that we've developed. So currently we are kind of finalizing the ADCIRC and SWAN model setups for Lake Ontario based on the feedback that we received from our calibration and validation report. Concurrently, we're also working on the development and calibration of our ADCIRC and SWAN coupled models for Lake Superior, because that's the next lake that we're going to be tackling with our modeling. We're also in the process of developing the DEM for the next set of lakes that are going to be modeled, which are Lake Michigan and Huron. So just to be clear, the team at ERDIC has developed a model for Lake Ontario, and we're currently developing the model for Lake Superior. And we will be contracting with Baird to develop a single model that comprises both Lakes Michigan and Huron, and then a single model that comprises Lake Erie and St. Clair. So Baird will be working on Michigan, Huron, Erie, and St. Clair. Right now, the ERDIC team is working on developing some of the inputs that the contractors will be using as they develop those models. So we're developing the DEM for Lake Michigan and Huron right now. We're also working on selecting the 8 different validation storms that we'll be using for validation of Lake Michigan and Huron, and also selecting what we're calling the baseline storms for Lake Michigan and Huron. So I mentioned that we're going to be modeling different water levels and ice coverage conditions for all of the lakes. So what we're terming the baseline storms are basically just a set of 180 different historic storms that we're going to be running for historic conditions, just as kind of the first set of runs that we're going to do. And then when we get the different lake level and ice coverage conditions from the work that's been conducted by the other teams, then we will repeat simulations for those 180 storms, but just applying different combinations of those lake levels and ice coverage conditions. So right now we're working on figuring out what are the baseline storms that we're going to be running for Lakes Michigan and Huron once the model validation is complete for those lakes. So kind of the next steps that we're doing for the next couple months that we're going to be doing on our side of this project is we're going to be producing the final report that's summarizing the validation process that we used for Lake Ontario. We'll also commence the baseline simulations for Lake Ontario. So we'll be running the 180 historic storms that have been identified for Lake Ontario. We will then be submitting kind of a similar report to the one we've already generated for Lake Ontario, but this time for Lake Superior, that goes into the entire calibration and validation and development process for the Lake Superior model. That will also be submitted to a group of subject matter experts within the Army Corps for internal review. Once the storms have been selected for Lake Michigan and Huron, we'll also be generating the wind pressure and ice fields for the 180 storms that are chosen for each of those lakes. And then finally, we'll be evaluating storms as in order to choose the storms that will be run for Lake Erie and St. Clair to follow up the modeling that's done for Lake Michigan and Huron. I apologize for kind of rushing through that, but I know we have a limited amount of time to go through the wave and surge modeling today. So I'd be happy to take any questions that you all might have about our efforts for this project.
Thanks, Margaret. So we'll pause here for any questions for Margaret and team on the wave and surge modeling. Okay. Not seeing anything in the chat or hands raised. So thanks, Margaret, for providing that great update. And we will move on in our agenda. So next we have an update on the planning and engineering design checklist. As I mentioned at the top of the meeting, this is another one of our deliverables. So the checklists we are developing are intended to be companions to the future conditions lake level modeling that we're doing. And so they are really focused on designing for fluctuating water levels and wave and surge conditions that we may expect to see in the future. So kind of where we're at is we heard from our state stakeholders that there were 3 primary habitat types of concern that we should focus our checklist on. And so those are dune habitats, fish reef habitats, and coastal wetlands. So in April, the Army Corps team developed a draft planning and engineering design checklist for each of these 3 habitat types. We circulated the initial drafts with our volunteer state stakeholders that had offered up their review capacity for the checklist, which was great. We have received feedback and suggestions for improvement from our state partners, and we'll be incorporating those into the next iteration of the checklist. And I do have some examples here. So I know this is small, but just wanted to give you a flavor for what these products are shaping up to look like. So this is an example of our planning checklist. And so the intent of the planning checklist is to help coastal resource managers determine if a proposed site may be suitable for a restoration project before design begins. So we're looking at including considerations on site conditions, water levels, like baseline conditions, and also what you may expect to see in the future in terms of highs and lows, sediment transport considerations, and then also looking at the wave environment, wave energy, circulation patterns, what they look like now and what they may look like in the future. And so we have one of these for each of those 3 habitat types. And then the next screen grab is an example of what we're putting together for the engineering design checklist. So the intent of this one is a little bit different. This is more advanced, and it's intended to help designers or engineers determine if they have considered the appropriate data sources, if they have taken, correct assumptions, or have the correct assumptions been incorporated into the design, and plans, specs, drawings. We also want this checklist to be used to encourage conversations around adaptive management. So how might you be able to incorporate adaptive management, into your plans? So in addition to these kind of considerations and thought process, we're also intending to include links to relevant data sources like the Coastal Hazard System, where you'll be able to pull down the appropriate data that to kind of help to answer the prompting question. So we recognize that this won't be exhaustive. We won't be able to incorporate links to every data source, but we do have good suggestions from the state partners, and we will definitely include links to the future conditions data that will come out of this project. So that's kind of where we're at with the checklist. We're currently working on a next round of edits, and we'll be including the links to the CHS information once it's available further along in the study. But we've made some good progress here, and we're really thankful to our stakeholders for their input in making these a better product. Before I move on to our final piece, I do want to pause and ask if there are any questions about the checklist, or if you haven't had a chance to review it, if you weren't on that initial list of volunteers and you would like to take a look, you can also reach out to me. Scudder, go ahead.
Yeah, just one question I have, and I was focused on something else briefly. In terms of the wetlands, this particular checklist, in some of the work that we're doing, and I think and potentially in other states, and this is not just for wetlands, that we're starting to incorporate more nature-based software engineering designs. Okay, and so in terms of the checklist, I'm thinking about the checklist itself may need to be adaptive as our design, our thinking about appropriate designs change in response to climate. And I'm saying if we start incorporating some new and innovative nature-based designs, I think the checklist is still appropriate, but there may be aspects of the checklist that are not, or will need to be modified to incorporate that different type of thinking. Again, nature-based designs may be, they may not be static. They may be designed, they may change shape and form. And I think that there are probably a somewhat different set of questions that may be need to ask there. So I'm just sort of, I don't know, maybe throwing rocks at the window or something, but just saying that this needs to be an adaptive checklist.
Yeah, thank you, Scudder. That that is a very valuable comment, and we are thinking about that as well. We are definitely wanting to make sure we're incorporating natural nature-based features and starting to move in that direction. I believe that we have some of that built into the checklist. These checklists are definitely not prescriptive, so we're not recommending certain types of measures in here. They are focused more on just prompting questions and getting you to think about your design. But I've noted that down, and when we do our next iteration, we'll take your comment into consideration, because I do think that it's a great one. And then I don't know if Jim is on the line. I don't want to. I don't want to put you on the spot, but just give you a chance to respond if you want to.
I think that's a great idea. We just need to figure out how do we make these checklists like open source checklists. So as our solutions evolve over time, these are editable rather than just locked in place. So I don't think that's difficult to do. And really, thanks to Scudder for it. We wouldn't have the concept design checklist if he hadn't said, hey, you guys should have a concept design checklist, not just an engineering checklist. So keep the good comments flowing, Scudder. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jim. And thanks, Scudder.
I owe it all to having Wheaties for breakfast every morning. So.
Okay, so I didn't see any additional comments come through the chat, so I'll move on to the last portion of our meeting, which is a review of the study schedule. So this revised schedule incorporates our the target dates for deliverables now that we have a handle on the bias correction. So you will see here that the yellow star, July 2024, was the original date that we were targeting for completion of all modeling. Given the challenges that we just walked through today and how intensive that was to develop a suitable solution and a good foundation for the modeling that we could feel comfortable moving forward, that did push out our schedule because it took a number of months. So you can see now our new estimated date for completion is March of 2025. That's the only thing that's changed on the schedule. We are still keeping our same workflow. So you'll see that, for example, the wave and surge and the CHS, it'll still follow our lake by lake approach. So nothing has changed there, but we have shifted the dates. We think that this is a reasonable schedule, and we're driving towards this new completion date because we know that everyone's very excited for the data, and it also does have broader implications for example, for the Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Study. So I think I'll add, I don't know, John, anything else on the schedule, or anyone from the team want to add anything about the study schedule before we close out?
No. Thank you, Caitlin.
Okay. All right. So with that, I think I will bring the meeting to a close. Thank you for your attention this morning. I know today was a little heavy on the technical side, but we had a lot to report out on. As Lauren and others mentioned, this was a very iterative process, and really the whole team played a large role in working out the problem and getting us to where we are today. So we feel confident moving forward, and we're really excited for the next 3 months and the completion of the baseline and starting our climate scenario modeling. This meeting, I did record it, so we will make it available. I'll be sending out the recording probably within the next few days once we're able to get that up on our district YouTube channel. And then I'll put in a plug for our next quarterly progress meeting, which is scheduled for the 20th of September at the same time, 2 p.m. Central, 3 p.m. Eastern. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Take care.
Thanks.